This PowerPoint presentation will be a review of bad hermeneutical systems that lead to a bad interpretation of scriptures. Bad hermeneutics lead to an incorrect interpretation and therefore an incorrect application of scripture. This PowerPoint, as well as all of those produced by Dr. John McLean, are copyrighted and should not be used without written permission from the author. Now let us review the definition of good hermeneutics. In good hermeneutics, an exegetic interprets the text from the original author to the original recipients within the historical and cultural context. Exegesis engages the historical, literal, or what I call natural, grammatical, and literary meaning of the text from the original author to the original recipients. Another component of a good definition of good hermeneutics is that the exegesis seeks to answer two major questions from the text. First of all, what is the author talking about? Or what is the thesis? What is the main subject? Secondly, what does the author say about what he is talking about? How does the author, in writing or speaking, develop the thesis, the argumentation for it, the support for it, in order to convince the reader or the hearer of the validity and truthfulness of the subject? Exegesis, two main questions. What is the author talking about? What does the author say about what he's talking about? If you keep these two questions in the forefront of your mind as you read the text, you will be driven to the truth. The difficulty is that all too often we do bring presuppositions or biases to the text. A good interpreter is an interpreter who must be an inspector general, not a prosecuting attorney or a defense attorney. A prosecuting attorney looks at the evidence, looks at the information, and says, I have to convict this person who is on trial. The defense attorney looks at all the same information and says, how do I get my client off? How do I cast doubt in the mind of the jury? You see, a prosecuting attorney and a defense attorney, they have an agenda, and we must avoid the various agendas of bias, of theology, of passion, of expectation, and bringing those to the text. An inspector general is a person who is challenged, commissioned, authorized to look for the truth, to examine the data, to examine the information. And the inspector general is not a prosecuting attorney or a defense attorney. They are simply someone who is pursuing the truth wherever the truth leads them. And they present the data so that then a truthful and valid and correct interpretation can be made. We must allow the text to change our views rather than our views being imposed upon the text. Be an inspector general who asks two good questions. What is the author talking or writing about? Secondly, what does the author say or write about what he is talking about? I will divide this PowerPoint into two major sections: bad hermeneutics amongst evangelicals, and then bad hermeneutics amongst academics or intellectuals. Bad hermeneutics amongst evangelicals are hermeneutics that are used by Christian preachers and teachers, most often ignorantly, because they do not know better and they have not been taught better. Evangelicals are those who adhere to the gospel of Jesus Christ, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ for humanity's sin. And so evangelicals embrace a solid gospel. They embrace the traditional theology of the church, and they seek to teach the Word of God, but often with bad hermeneutics, they find themselves teaching a message that God never said, and that leads to application that God never intended. Allegorical interpretation is very common in evangelical circles. The contextual interpretation is discarded for a supposedly deeper mystical understanding of the text. The teaching may be nice lessons, but has nothing to do with the authorial purpose. The interpretation is generated from the imagination without linguistic controls to guide the interpretive process. Allegorical is different than allegory. Allegory is a legitimate figure of speech. Some would say it's a type of genre or style of writing. And there is allegory, but little in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But an allegorical approach to the Bible discards the historical cultural interpretation from the original author to the original recipients. An example would be when some say that the book of Esther is about the struggle of the Christian life. Esther is the Christian. Haman is the old nature or the devil, and Mordecai is the new nature or sometimes the Holy Spirit. Esther is not about the struggle, they would say, of the Jewish people during a period of captivity, but it is to be Christianized or baptized into Christian theology. Another example is the Song of Solomon. They would say the Song of Solomon is really about Christ's love for the church. It's not about the celebration, the courtship, the maturation, and the marriage of a man and a woman during the period of King Solomon's reign. They would say that it is simply a typology, an allegorizing of Christ's love for the church. This again is a complete disregarding of the placement and the revelation of God, the deposit of this literature at a time in the Old Testament to the nation of Israel when God is seeking to communicate about the sanctity of love, sexuality, and marriage. Spiritualized interpretation. This is similar to allegorical, but the interpreter may acknowledge historical events, but completely neglects to build the application on the historical purpose. Examples would be, God wants us to conquer our sins, diet, financial problems, etc., just like the Israelites conquered Jericho. Just as Jesus blessed the water and turned it into wine, so God can bless your tithe and return it with great benefits. For this one, though, there's always a hitch. You have to give the money to the person who is speaking. You just can't give it to help the poor. Abram goes down to Egypt, which represents the world with its lust. Palestine represents the place of obedience, the blessings in the church. As long as you remain in Palestine, in the church, then you will receive the blessings. But if you go outside the church or leave the church, you'll be in the world and you will be tempted by its lusts. Now, the things that are being said are nice things, nice applications, but they're built upon a false premise. And if you go into a diet or a financial business dealing or other kinds of addictions and you base it upon the conquering of Jericho, then you are building it upon a false narrative, a false premise. Spiritualizing interpretation neglects the authorial intent from the original author to the original recipients and simply via imagination creates an application to motivate you rather than to transform you. The typological interpretation abuses or misuses what is a valid genre or figure of speech. In the typological interpretation, everything in the Bible is but a foreshadowing and or fulfillment in relationship to Jesus Christ. The fundamental error here is again that the person neglects the historical, cultural, authorial intention from the original author to the original recipients. Everything in the Old Testament looks forward to Jesus Christ. Everything in the New Testament looks back to the Old Testament as a fulfillment of the past shadows. This approach disregards the authorial and historical purpose to the various periods of time when God deposited this information. When he deposited it during the patriarchal period, pre-law, during the period of the law, and then of course during the period of the law you have the united kingdom, you have the divided kingdom, then you have the soul kingdom, then you have the period of exile with the pre-exilic, exilic, and post-exilic prophets. There is a complete neglect to God's work in history. Another example would be that every detail of the tabernacle symbolizes something in the life of Christ. There are authentic or valid types in the Old Testament, and this will be explained later in another PowerPoint presentation. There is the cross-reference interpretation. The interpreter searches for cross-references to the neglect of the immediate context and imports information into the passage. The interpreter has no appreciation of authorial intent or the various personalities of the writers. This particular error is aided by our study Bibles, which in the margins have cross-references. And we have been taught to look up all of those cross-references and to see what they have to say about the passage that we are currently studying. The problem is that these cross-references were never available to the original author, to the original recipients, and they were not a part of the author's purpose in writing. They may provide additional information, but it might be additional information that is actually different. For instance, a reconstruction of the life of Christ based on the four Gospels does not do honor or recognize the various purposes that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had for their particular audiences. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written to different audiences of different religious backgrounds, of different ethnic makeups, and therefore we need to understand each book separately. When you, like the Reader's Digest did years ago or others, create a harmony or a shorter version of the Gospels all in one, you really do not have the Word of God as it was intended. Another example is that James and Paul have different perspectives on works. And so if you import to James what Paul wrote, or import to Paul what James wrote, you're importing the same words, but words with different meanings within the semantic domain. When James is talking about works, he's contrasting faith and works. When Paul is talking about works, sometimes he's talking about a legalistic system. Other times he's talking about works that are produced by genuine faith. Paul and John have different perspectives on the word fellowship or partnerships. So cross-referencing is taking information from outside the book and bringing it in. I know that there is a long-standing principle of hermeneutics that Scripture interprets Scripture, but this is more of a systematic theology perspective rather than an exegetical perspective. Cross-reference interpretation has great limitations, and this will be discussed further in another PowerPoint presentation. Another wrong hermeneutic is the dogmatic denomination interpretation. The Bible is interpreted through a theological bias or an ecclesiastical tradition that demands it fit into the system. The interpreter wears theological glasses through which the Bible is read. The theological system governs the interpretation rather than the interpretation refining or governing the theological interpretation. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. What does the word world mean in this context? For the Calvinist, it could be the world of the elect. For the Arminian, it might be the world of those who choose to believe. For the Baptist, it might be simply the world of mankind. What we find is that if we bring our denominational distinctives, our ecclesiastical covenants and traditions to the text, then we are not the inspector general, but we are either the prosecuting or the defense attorney. We are either trying to prove something or defend something rather than inspecting it as an objective interpreter. We must be the inspector general who seeks the truth, and we refine the theology based upon the sound exegesis. Another example is 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1. False prophets were secretly introduced. They introduced destructive heresies. They will introduce these destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction on themselves. Sovereign Lord and bought are very important theological terms, but we cannot determine the meaning of the text based on our theology as a prosecuting or defense attorney. What we must do is look at these words as an inspector general and say, what do these words mean in Peter's vocabulary, in 1 Peter, in 2 Peter, or even in the Gospel of Mark, as we are told by good church tradition that Peter was Mark's primary source for writing his gospel. Whether you're in Catholicism, a Baptist, a Calvinist, Arminian, a Pentecostal, or an independent, we must avoid being prosecuting or defense attorneys who are trying to prove something and remain as inspector generals who approach the text as objectively as possible. The predictive interpretation sees the scriptures, and particularly prophetic scriptures. The scriptures contain cryptic, symbolic codes that point to future events. The interpreter must get underneath the plain sense of Scripture and discover the secret message that relates to current and future events. People who have made a life of predictive interpretation are those like Hal Lindsey, Jack Van Impe, John Hagee, Peter Popoff, Michael Drosnin, Jeffrey Satinover, and many, many more. These are interpreters who have the Bible held in one hand and a newspaper in the other, and with good intention, they are trying to say this is that, and they neglect the historical, cultural, authorial intent of the prophecy and seek to always find a contemporary fulfillment. Therefore, arrows in the Old Testament become Scud missiles, and chariots become M1 or more advanced tanks as they continue to develop. Now, Bible prophecy is a legitimate, God-given genre to communicate to us about the future. But if we start taking everything in the Bible and seeking a cryptic, symbolic, secret code of some kind of fulfillment for today, then we are going to be abusing the text and neglecting the historical and cultural predictions. This is very true of the major prophets, particularly Daniel and Ezekiel, and then, of course, the book of Revelation. Predictive interpretation should not seek cryptic, symbolic codes. The Bible does give us guidance and direction concerning symbols and the interpretation of these kinds of figures of speech. And we will provide a PowerPoint presentation that helps us to not only understand how to interpret prophecy, but how to interpret prophecy in light of future events. I have defined this wrong hermeneutic as the prophet interpretation. The person claims special revelation from God, which provides the interpretation or new revelation from God. The person claims to be an apostle, a prophet, or a special spokesperson from God. There is the combination of allegorization, spiritualization, and most important, pontification in a declaration of the meaning of the text as a direct message from God. These people are often health, wealth, and prosperity preachers. Benny Hinn, Joyce Meyer, Ken Copeland, Creflo Dollar, and I could name many, many more. These people claim a special relationship in which God speaks and whispers in their ear, when God meets with them face to face, when God gives them an audible voice and tells them what to tell us to do. The authority is not resting in Scripture alone, but they believe in a new revelation and even a new interpretation. But there's always a hitch. Very often we must give them money so that they can have God release blessings upon us. These are false prophets, providing false interpretations that bring great disappointment to the lives of God's children who believe them rather than interpreting God's word. The wooden literal interpretation in this approach fails to appreciate literary styles and figures of speech that bring pictures, sensations, experiences, and expressions to the Scriptures. There's a failure to appreciate the poetry and the literary styles of Scripture. This interpretation is so wooden in the concrete understanding that an interpreter would have us cut off our right arm or gouge out our right eye in order to fulfill the passage. Examples would be when we are said to take the log out of your eye before you take the speck out of another. There needs to be an appreciation of the hyperbole and the contrast that is going on here. It's not a real log and it's not a real speck. Another example would be to look upon a woman, they would say, is actual adultery. It is the same as actual adultery via physical sexual contact. And yet it is described as adultery of the heart. A camel going through the eye of a needle. People want to think of a real camel going through a real needle, or maybe a needle gate, which has been propagated by guides in Israel for many, many years, but has no historical, cultural, or interpretive basis upon which to say that. There has been no needle gate. There has been no camel having to crawl through such a gate. But they would take it so literally rather than seeing the hyperbole or the exaggeration of the impossibility of a camel being able to go through a needle. Other usages would be the usages of anthropomorphisms for God. God doesn't have hands. He doesn't have legs. He doesn't have an arm. And so they fail to appreciate these figures of speech, these poetic expressions that allow us as human beings of His creatures and how we relate to others to understand how God relates to us. Wooden literal interpretation tries to take everything so concrete, so real in existence, that it fails to appreciate the literary styles and figures of speech. The engagement of the personalized or devotional interpretation finds the reader makes every passage relate directly to herself or himself. The Bible is read for a devotional message, which is driven by the person's current spiritual or physical needs. The emotional state of the person seeks validation and or direction for a contemporary life moment. We do not go to the text for an application, but we go to the text for an interpretation. And it is in the proper interpretation then we find the proper application. A humorous story or a joke based on the book of Ephesians. The book of Ephesians says, put off the old man and put on the new man. Christian counselor said one time a woman came into his office and said, I, in my devotionals today, learned from God that I'm to divorce my husband. The counselor said, why? How did you see such a thing when the scriptures say quite the contrary? And she said, well, I read today in Ephesians, I'm to put off the old man and to put on the new man. I'm going to divorce my husband and marry my boyfriend. Now that's a ludicrous or funny story, but yet it is the reality in which some people approach the scriptures. They are looking for validation. They are looking for application. They are looking for the scriptures to tell them what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. The prayer of Jabez many years ago became very popular, and a book exploded about it, that if you will just pray the prayer of Jabez, spiritual, physical, and financial prosperity and other good things will come to you, as if it was a guaranteed kind of spiritual chant or mystical message. The prayer of Jabez was to the prayer of Jabez. It was to him, not to all of us individually. And although there are principles there that we can, in a sense, pray for or hope for or maybe live by, there are no guarantees. In the personalized or devotional interpretation, people are claiming promises to individuals for themselves. Promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to David, to others were to them and probably not to us. If you approach the text with only a devotional mindset, seeking some validation for this day, you will not get the right interpretation, and you will probably get the wrong application. The proof text or dogmatic issues interpretation is very common again in ecclesiastical or theological circles. A verse taken out of context or isolated from its context is given an interpretation that stands almost all alone. The interpreter takes one verse or phrase and builds an entire doctrine or sermon from it. This approach usually neglects the context and authorial intent. This abusive approach does not mean that there are no proof texts in the Bible. God only needs to say something one time for it to be true. But in a proof text or dogmatic issue interpretation, you might have examples like, "You visited me in prison." And so an entire prison ministry or prison obligation is placed upon the listeners or a congregation to the neglect of the prophetic context of this particular passage. Or one of the best known verses in the world for believers and non-believers, "Do not judge so you will not be judged," is taken out of context as if we are not supposed to provide some kind of discernment, judgment, evaluation, that any kind of judgment is wrong judgment. Or the idea of confess your sins to one another, and all of a sudden now the saints have to go to a priest or some clergy or some special person to confess their sins to those individuals in some kind of authoritative position, and that is the way the forgiveness takes place. Another one is, "This is my body given for you." There are groups or denominations that say it's the actual body of Christ. Others say it's the spiritual presence of Christ. Others say it's memorial or symbolic. But the issue is, what does it mean in that context? There are others who have taken Old Testament verses and they have sought to create a kind of military militia based upon it, in which they claim the right to not only defend, but to go on the offensive for the sake of what they believe is God's will. A verse taken out of context is never acceptable to good hermeneutics. The second part of this PowerPoint will look at bad hermeneutics among secular academics and non-believing intellectuals. The secular academics refers to those who are professors or teachers in secular universities in various religion departments. The non-believing intellectuals are those who write about philosophy, theology, and religion from a secular perspective, or are critics of the scriptures seeking to undermine the faith of the Christian community. Rationalistic interpretation is primarily engaged by non-believers, but unfortunately there are some believers who also engage this hermeneutic. The interpretation is maintained within the realm of human comprehension or human reason. If it cannot be proven by scientific investigation, then it must be modified to be believable. The rationalist cannot understand how God can be three persons in one essence, so the triunity of God is dismissed for another model. The rationalist cannot understand how Adam's sin impacted the humanity of all people, so there is a denial of original sin. Jacob's dream was but a way of explaining his broken hip. The plagues of Egypt were just natural catastrophes. Some Christians only believe what they can comprehend. Rationalistic interpretation seeks to eliminate all of the miracles, the wonders, and things outside the scientific realm so that the Bible becomes myth and legend that was embraced by ignorant people. The mythological interpretation is similar to the rationalistic interpretation, but it adds an extra dynamic or element in which they will compare the Bible to other ancient Near Eastern religious stories or folklore, in their opinion, to show that such mythological concepts were common amongst ancient people, ignorant people. The myth story represents the vehicle by which a lesson is taught. The Bible doesn't contain actual history. The message is grounded in a fanciful record of folklore. Jonah and the great fish. The interpreter cannot understand how a man could be swallowed by a great fish. So the story is a myth that is used to teach a spiritual lesson. They will look for other parallels of similar stories of Jonah or Job or other characters to show that this was just the religious community's way of trying to deal with human issues. Samson could not have tied 300 foxtails together, so it must be a myth to teach a spiritual lesson. A six-day creation contradicts science, so it must be folklore that magnifies the concept of a creator God. They will look at parallels throughout other religious writings and cosmogonies, particularly in the ancient Near Eastern historical context, to show that all of these are just religious, ignorant people seeking to explain things that are beyond their comprehension. The historical religious interpretation, or hermeneutic, says that the Bible contains nebulous history from the perspective of religious cultural society. The text is a record of the community's understanding of events, but doesn't contain any true revelation or history about God. The Israelites perceived that God was with them when they were victorious, but when God was angry, he would cause them to lose a battle. They were steeped in the cultural deception of believing in gods. They thought that Yahweh was greater than Baal when Yahweh gave them victory over the Canaanites. But when the Canaanites defeated them, then obviously Yahweh was angry with them, or he was inferior to Baal. They perceived that this was mere superstition playing out in the events and theology or religious culture of the nation. The Exodus was Israel's gods defeating the gods of Egypt. The death of Sennacherib's army was actually a plague, they would say, but it was interpreted by the Israelites to be their God sending a death angel across the army of Sennacherib. All historical events were interpreted with a religious worldview of whether you were in a good or bad relationship with God, whether you had appeased him or angered him. It's not uncommon for people today to look at world events and to make speculative, even outrageous statements about how God was involved in the world event or the catastrophe. Another poor hermeneutic is the literary genre interpretation. The person understands the Bible to be great cultural literature, but not the Word of God. They read it as they would read other great masterpieces, but they do not believe that it is a divine revelation for faith or practice. Esther is a wonderful story about the courage of a woman in a male-dominated world. The Hollywood remake of the story of Moses or Ruth or David or others. Psalms are wonderful poems about human experiences. Proverbs are a wonderful collection of the sage sayings or the wisdom sayings of the past. But none of these are divine revelation. They are simply the collections of elevated writings from past religious communities. The redefinition of contextual words. Redefining words to support a social moral context rather than the historical text. In the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, etc. communities these days, they argue that the Bible does not address homosexuality as it exists in its current contemporary expression, that the Old Testament and the New Testament were dealing with a religious violation or a cultural violation, a violation of inhospitality, versus what is going on today in that community where men love men and women love women and any kind of combination is acceptable. They argue that the Bible is not addressing their situation, but situations that had religious, cultural, or other manners and customs violations. And so they will redefine words so as to make them mean one thing in ancient history and then something completely different in modern history. This is common in social, moral, and contemporary cultural discussions. This completes our study of bad hermeneutics. This PowerPoint, along with all others, is copyrighted by Dr. John McLean and should not be used or duplicated without written permission from Dr. McLean.